Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome back. Thanks for the great discussion yesterday. I feel like I'm going to be stating a lot of the obvious this morning, but maybe it's only obvious because, in the mobile world, we're all sort of deep into this. But I'd like to just give a quick bit of data about, how mobile adoption works and so on, and then put up a couple of thoughts on that'll help contribute maybe or maybe not. We're all data nuts, and everybody would like to kind of know, how hard is it for us to depend on mobile? Obviously, if we're going to do the genomic stuff, that's obviously the plan. But you have to compare it to something, right? It doesn't help to have the gene sequence unless we can figure out what any of it means. And we've got a good hypothesis that a lot of that data that can go to the phenotype, the precision phenotype, might be able to come from something to do with mobile. And obviously, the smarter the mobile, the better. So how pervasive is that? And this is sort of a notion of some of those things. I thought we all worry about the fact that our older population is more at peril and more expensive and more expressive of the diseases that we're mostly treating. And therefore, we need to know the likelihood of these people having mobile technology. So if you look at the far right there, you can see that this year, we're in the vicinity of 65 or 2/3 or so percent of the boomer generation uses mobile devices. And the percent with any mobile phone, I put just in numbers down there. My mother has a mobile phone. She's 90, and she turns it on once or twice a year, whether she needs to or not. So this data represents people who have them and use them. This isn't just people who have them. They must use it at least every month to show up on this graph. I thought it might be useful. We get wildly varying ideas of mobile apps. I think the data that is absolutely certain is that in 1992 there were 0, and in 2002 also. But the question of how many mobile apps there actually are in the health field is wildly variable. It's clearly large. If you were to just go to your iPhone and type in the word diabetes in the search function under apps, you'll get an answer of 1,128 apps that have to do with diabetes. If you do health, you'll get 4,000-ish. Turns out that the iOS operating system can't give you a number larger than about 4,000. If you ask the question, how many apps have something to do with whatever? So you can't get the answer directly from the App Store. But if you sort of iterate around it, it's clearly in the tens of thousands of apps that have something to do with health care, if you include something to do with fitness or wellness or other kinds of tracking in there. Many of them are used by one person. So we have a bias there, a long tail. There's data that a significant portion of people, and you've heard several of us say this yesterday, and I won't dwell on it, but there are tens of millions, certainly close to 100 million people who have at least used mobile apps in the health space at least once. And have signed up for it, have turned it on, have toyed with it, or tinkered or whatever. I've tinkered with them maybe hundreds of times, but there's tons of stuff out there. Point is, this stuff is pervasive and becoming more so. We're early in the market, just like we were early in the PC market and early in these other markets. Patient monitoring, I'm dividing from apps, meaning devices that also contribute to figuring out what's going on. And there are clearly thousands of these today. I've got a little picture of many of them. I wanted my marketing people to give me just a shot of hundreds of different kinds of devices. Just in our labs at Verizon in Waltham, we've got an innovation lab. And we've got products from over 100 companies that we routinely demonstrate, right? So it's very, very pervasive. It's quite easy to get things like glucose and weight and blood pressure and all those things. There are dozens of companies each in those spaces that can get that data directly to the mobile cloud. Some of them go directly, some of them go through a phone, some of them go through an 802.11 Bluetooth or whatever hub, but that stuff is all quite available. The trick is making it easy for my mom, making it so that it isn't going to require her to have a PhD in computer science to get her data somewhere. But it is growing rapidly, and it is available, for purposes of study. There's plenty of devices today that can be leveraged today to get the work done. This will only get easier and less infringing and more and less expensive and so on as time goes on. I already showed you this thing. I put up another one. This isn't just about direct data that we consider health data, and this is the sort of place we need to get our head. We need to get our head away from thinking about glucose or direct measures of albumin, however many that was yesterday, are things that, the kinds of things we need. We did oops, I went the wrong way there. We did a little study we made a test watch. We made 1,000 copies of a watch in one of my incubation groups. That was not just about being, it had an accelerometer and GPS and all that, but it also was a phone. It wasn't just something that relayed to a phone. It was a phone itself. So you didn't need to carry a phone and to have a watch, right? It did both. And we put in some algorithms that could detect falls, right? So that you could have the I've fallen and can't get up function, right? Because if you're going to get people to do things, it's very useful to figure out what's in it for them. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. If you can get them to want it for some reason and you use it for a different reason, that's the ideal sort of situation to make things go. But it turns out that we did a project with a company that does, I put those pictures on the right about the security system in your house. The security systems in houses now have little sensors to see if the window opened or closed. But in order to not cost too much to deploy them, most of them have become wireless, right? And most of the sensors get put there with a little glue. I just used some glue in the back room this morning, right? Just stick it on the wall and you're done. You know, that's the total work. So we decided we'd go stick it on the wall next to the medicine cabinet, or stick it on the drawer to see if that drawer opened or not, where the pills were. Or to see whether somebody moved in the bedroom. They're motion detectors, right? And you could tell, and so what is this data? Well, it's really about intrusion into the house, but it really tells you whether the diabetic or the person recovering from their, quad bypass, or the person doing whatever, whether they're moving or not, right? Whether the disease is getting better or not can be inferred from these secondary sorts of things. This is the notion of big data. And if you have that kind of data and you have a question you're trying to ask, you can ask the question of the data even though you're not getting the answer you're exactly asking for, right? But the inferred answer can be better at volume, as we talked about yesterday, than the direct answer that you can only get at small instances. So this inferred data is available and is widely around. You know, there's tens of millions of houses who already have these sensors. Why wouldn't you just leverage them, right? So we made this sort of diagram that said, well, let's think about this problem of beyond the notion of making clinical trials work better. I don't know if Francis remembers, but I was with you in a meeting at the FDA a year or two ago, and maybe I was being audacious, I don't know, but I don't think double-blind clinical trials are going to be the gold standard in the future. I think they're going to be the second best kind of research. we are inventing the new, best kind of research. Because getting a sample is interesting, and you have to randomize it and do all that. But wouldn't it be better to have all cases? Right? We are at the cusp of being able to have all. That's where we are, right? If you narrow diabetes down to the 57 components that make my diabetes different than yours, and we all know they're somehow different, so they must be genetically different, right? They can't just be the same. So if we narrow that down to what those things are, and we can figure out what those little microphenotypes are, then we have a far better notion of figuring out what's going on. I was reminded when I was standing in the back of the room yesterday that I have what my family calls the jitzes. I can't sit still. Restless leg. There's names for all this stuff. I realized that it came from the mother's side of my family because, she's 90-something and never sits down. My uncle, who's 90-something older, was a bomber pilot in World War II, still flies airplanes. Maybe jitzes have something to do with longevity, right? I don't know. But we're going to be able to figure that out with this sort of study, mostly through not clinical trials, although that's obviously something that we want for the short term, but mostly through a new kind of science that's a combination of observational science of the new data and big data. That sort of combination is what's available. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.